A good rule of thumb when we think about anything related to recycling or compostable things or whatever, like, it's probably not going to end up down the happy path that you think it's going to. And that we don't mean to scare you or cause more climate anxiety with you, but just like taking a step back and being curious, because we talk so much about that word too. Like just being curious and thinking, maybe that's not really what happens.
Something my wife just brought up, and she did not know this. And she said, you should start to talk about this on your podcast. She thought that if you didn't know, she thought all the food waste, if you put it in the trash, it biodegrades. I said, that makes no sense to me. Think about it. You've got layers and layers of plastic. So what if your biodegradable sits on the plastic? I said, it's not going into compost. And then I talked to somebody else the other day, and they thought the same thing. Yeah. They said, if I don't compost, I throw it in the trash. It's just going to decompose.
Oh, no.
No way. No. It's sitting on a layer of plastic the entire time. And so maybe that is a big myth that people just need to understand better. And I'm sure they have good intentions, but you cannot throw your compost stuff in the trash.
No, and I think we talk a lot about myth busting just in that same realm where and a lot of people, especially folks that are kind of more loud and, maybe designed to try and rile people up more than educate, like they like to use the term greenwashing a lot and et cetera, et cetera. Like, I don't use that term too much just because I think most of the time greenwashing comes from a lack of understanding from the consumer. So like, yes, sometimes there are bad actors out there who are trying to make a product that is not very eco-friendly seem more eco-friendly. Sure, that is a traditional greenwashing. I actually don't think it goes on as much as people think. I think mostly what happens is this like well-meaning intention that gets turned into like actually nothing because you don't actually know how it works. And the education piece, like we were talking about, really comes back into it. I mean, one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had on the podcast was I talked with a gentleman who his family was literally multi-generational. He called them, they had a term for it, but like basically rag sifters. Like starting the Great Depression, they went through and found discarded clothing. They would upcycle things. They would, resell things. And this was like his family lineage. And so as this gentleman continued to go down his path of life, he thought, well, nobody knows where your clothes actually go. Like nobody, everybody thinks you donate them to Goodwill and somebody magically wears your shirt again. And he's like, absolutely not. Like, unfortunately, this really doesn't happen. And I think more and more we've seen, videos or photos of people in countries less fortunate than ours, where they're like literally standing on tops of mountains of clothing that like we've just decided to ship to them without their permission. So like there's a graveyard of clothing that exists overseas. And, I would just say a good rule of thumb when we think about anything related to recycling or compostable things or whatever, like it's probably not going to end up down the happy path that you think it's going to. And that we don't mean to scare you or cause more climate anxiety with you, but just taking a step back and being curious, because we talk so much about that word too. Like just being curious and thinking, maybe that's not really what happens.
Where
instead
does my
of
trash
just
go? That's my topic this week. I interviewed Republic Services, which is one of the largest waste disposal companies in the country.
Oh, cool.
And that's a big topic was, where does all this stuff go? I've been so curious. Right. And I think a lot of people feel, even the recycling bin, oh, it's all getting recycled. No, it's not. And that's a big challenge that we have as a society, is the amount of trash that we produce. Like in our lifetimes in the US, we'll produce 128,000 pounds of trash per person. So you think about that and go, oh, well, the vast majority of that doesn't even end up being reused. But there's a lot of value in the waste stream. And so that's my hope. My hope right now is, especially with AI and tools and where we can sort things and do things faster, can we start to take that waste stream and continue to get more value out of it? And I think, a lot of these waste management companies are clearly motivated because they can profit from that. And that's fine. If we can start to do more things locally, I think that is really the key to more sustainable future.
Absolutely.
Why are we shipping plastics around the world,
Yeah, no, we don't need to be doing, you're right. Some of these like massive processes don't need to happen on a global scale. Like we absolutely need to bring things back locally. But I mean, I think speaking of bringing things back locally, I think that one of the best ways to teach people about like where your stuff actually goes is to get them involved in an OfferUp or a Buy Nothing or a circular like peer-to-peer sharing type community, because number one, you can see, this is the thing that I always find really interesting, is you can see what other people think is valuable.
Yeah.
You know, they might list something that you're like, excuse me, and they want like $50 or something for it. And we're like, nobody's going to pay you $50 for it. As a matter of fact, like you should pay them $50 to come remove this from your property, right? Because that's how much it would cost for, you know, the dump to come do it. But I also think it's interesting to, instead of saying in a happy world, I'm going to donate this I have a child, like she grows out of clothing all the time. Instead of me just thinking on a happy path, oh, I'm going to donate these clothes and maybe they'll end up, you know, on another kid that needs them. Like I can go to my Buy Nothing group and say, hey, look, I have a whole set of size 18 to 24-month-old clothing. Who wants it? And like many people will say, yes, I want it most of the time. And so I love that, because then you're like, okay, I actually see this item getting reused. Yeah. And there's also just like a fun community aspect to that as well. Like there's things that get passed around, like play sets and things. There's a play set in our, we haven't used it yet, but
especially the
there's
little
a play set in our neighborhood that's like the communal one.
It just keeps getting, oh, that's my old play set. You're the fifth owner now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same with bikes. My kids, we bought all my kids' bikes are on OfferUp, and I swear by the time they were 8, they were on like their 3rd bike each.
There you go.
Or, you know, a lot of these things, like your kids will outgrow them so fast.
I know.
Why are you buying them new? It doesn't make any sense.
No, we don't need any more of those.
No. Well, maybe since we're talking about products, let's also talk about, you know, on your website, you have a bunch of interesting products. And I know in the last year or so, we've been adopting more and more sustainable products, which are kind of interesting. One of the ones, especially with kids, I think is interesting is these little reusable rags.
Yeah.
How many towels do you go through? You know, once we started having kids, I'm like, man, I should have invested in Brawny or all these, you know, these big companies that owned all this, because you go through so much paper towels.
So many. And actually one of those replaces 17 rolls of paper towels, which is so cool.
And I love these because they just wipe the counters. You know, we still have paper towels, but now we use them way less because we use this for some of the basic stuff. And I think you have these on your website and stuff like this.
Absolutely. No, we love those types of products. And so Brightly does 2 things when it comes to products. First of all, we understand that, like, yes, when we talk about being a conscious consumer, we have to talk about products. Like, unfortunately, some people are like, that seems so counterintuitive. You're talking about like getting people to reduce consumption, etc. And of course, we want people to reduce things, but sometimes in order to reduce things, you do need to have an alternative. We also recognize that as consumers, we are buying things constantly, so we might as well figure out better ways to do it. So yes, we love Swedish dishcloths, which you have. Those are amazing. Replace 17 rolls of paper towels. One of our products takes it a step further. It's called a wish cloth. So it's a Swedish dishcloth, but it's a greeting card. So instead of sending somebody a greeting card over Christmas that they might display for a little bit and then eventually it gets recycled, which if it's printed and all these things, it may or may not end up where you think it does, where it goes. But you can just use it as a Swedish dishcloth.
That's, by the way, that's how we got into these. Somebody had sent me a greeting card and I thought it was interesting. And then we started, and then we ended up buying more of these.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, they work so well. And it's one of those things that just ends up being just a really cool swap. And then I brought a few things. So we also, in addition to having the Swedish dishcloth, which I think is really good for like wet messes and like you wet them and you kind of wipe things down. We actually do this thing where we also have, they're called paperless towels. So it's just like old school. Think about what your grandma did. We always say your grandma was probably way more sustainable than you were.
My grandma was a little too extreme. She would you'd go in her fridge and she would reuse the same, tinfoil and like saran wrap multiple times. And it was gross. And I said, okay, you've gone way too far.
Yeah, that's too much. She grew up
during the Great Depression, right? So you don't waste anything. But yeah,
that's so true. It's so true. There was
food in her fridge from like when I was born. It was
you're gross. Like, yeah, but you're right. I mean, I think that mentality bred a lot of invention and also just a love for not wanting to waste things. And so, yes, like these are literally what they would have as a handkerchief back in the day. I mean, it's a cotton flannel square. We sell a set of these, and these I use to wipe up stuff as well. So like Swedish dishcloth sometimes doesn't work for like a runny nose. So I just grab one of those. And then we have these like washable paper bins that they go in. So I just write like clean or dirty on them, and then there we go. So we have a little system in our house, and everyone, like my mom, like people that are not from the Great Depression era, right? Like more boomers, like they are the, ones that grew up in this convenience cycle.
Yeah.
And so my mom was kind of like, really? Like, this seems kind of gross. Like, don't you want to just throw things away when you're done? And she like came over to visit for a few weeks and was like, oh, I need a set like this. Like, it's just easy. When they're dirty, you throw them in the wash. Like,
yeah.
Ooh.
It's not that bad. But back to convenience. The other things back to the wash. I like these dry balls. So we use these, so we don't use any of those. And they're just like right next to the dryer. We throw them in. We don't use any of the old sheets anymore. And these
sheets, fabric softener. Yeah, you don't need it. We had a guest on the podcast. His name is escaping me, but we'll include in the show notes when we go back and do the research on this one. He had a TikTok video go viral because he held up 2 squares of fabric, one piece of fabric that had fabric softener on it. It had been washed multiple times with fabric softener. The other one never had. And the one fabric softener immediately lit up in flames because fabric softener is extremely flammable. And that went viral on TikTok because obviously that's very shocking and most people like don't understand this. And again, Brightly certainly is not in the business of trying to shock people into being sustainable. But I think it's important for people to understand that, like, yes, of course, there's going to be other concerns when you go into utilizing these types of additives into your home. But there's, in addition to wanting to maybe avoid that type of stuff, you also, even if you never saw that video and you didn't care, you could still use dryer balls as a way to, fluff your clothing up and not need to spend money on dryer sheets.
Yeah. Going back to I think it's back to sustainability. Is it convenient or is it more expensive, right? If you could do it for the same or cheaper, I was promoting these guys. And by the way, they don't pay me to do this. So I just think it's a cool product. So my wife got into this company, Drops. You guys
we love Drops. Yeah.
I love this company.
Yeah.
Because it comes in a cardboard box, and instead of the big, gigantic Tide box, you just got this little box, and inside, instead of filling all that soap in there, you just have these teeny pods, these teeny little things. And so it's just, so now we are hooked on these, and we're just going to keep doing that instead of all that plastic waste and the amount of chemicals. Like, this is such a small amount of chemical that it cleans just fine.
Yeah, exactly. No, and most of the time, that's the other thing too. Like, when we evaluate products, whether we're selling them on Brightly or we're recommending them for purchase elsewhere, we think a lot about what the actual impact is to the planet, whether or not it works, because I think that's a huge, like you just mentioned, hey, it works just as well. We've all tried the more eco-friendly alternative that didn't work, and we're just like, oh, screw it, and we go back to using whatever we were using. Yeah. And there's only so many of those interactions a person can take, especially if they're like new to the space, before they're just like, this is a bunch of baloney. It doesn't matter. So we think a lot about like whether or not it actually works, and then price, because look, we're in a situation right now where many Americans are unemployed. Everybody's got finances on the mind, and in many cases, sometimes these things seem like they're very expensive compared to a roll of paper towels, but over time they save you a ton of money. You were talking about your grandma reusing saran wrap and things. We have these things called reusable bowl covers that we sell at Brightly. And I'm obsessed with them because I'm just going to unfold them. They are literally, we have them reversible, which is kind of fun, but it's literally just this, this is made out of recycled plastic water bottles, which is cool. This polyester material. But all you do is you take the circular situation, put it on top of a bowl, and then you pull the drawstring cover. We have
the wax ones. Have you seen those? You just pull them over.
Yes.
Yep.
So there's so many different versions of it, but they work so well. I mean, the only downside I think to any of this is you have to be pretty organized because you might forget what's under there because you can't see it.
Well, and also back to your point, you look at the cost and you're like, oh, wow, that thing is so much more expensive than the saran wrap. But then you have to look at the useful life of it. And then you realize like, oh, wait a minute, like this, we've had this thing for, I don't know, a year. Yeah. It's still going. And so I think that's the thing just to be conscious of. Yes, you're paying more up front, but you're going to reuse. You're going to have it much longer. Two, you're going to actually make more of an impact.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, my thing with saran wrap is I always think about with any single-use plastic, I always, like, I'm a bleeding heart. I love animals. I love nature. I just think about those, like, sad videos of seeing animals in nature that are, like, wrapped up in plastic, or they have a straw up their nose or things like that. Like, it's just, it's unfortunate because obviously nobody means for those things to end up where they do. But there's so many, like we talked about, once you throw something in your trash can, there are so many ways that that stuff gets disposed of. There's so many opportunities for stuff to break open and get introduced into the ecosystem in ways that weren't originally intended. And so the best advice that I have is just to try to prevent it from getting into the waste stream, period, by using some of these things.
One of those, back to some of the impacts to nature, I often tell people that feel like it's too insurmountable, this problem, and I try to make it simple. I say, look, if you do two things, you can impact 25% of the plastics in our ocean. Number one, reusable water bottles. Number two, and you sell these on your website, reusable grocery bags. Yeah. And the tip I give people is put it in the door. Put it in your door of your car, not in the trunk. Because if you're in the trunk, you always end up in there and you're like, oh, dang it, where's my bag? And so use those bags, because those plastic bags and those water bottles, that's what's floating. That's a quarter of what is floating around our oceans. And those are the things that are impacting wildlife. We're eating those, by the way, because our fish are eating them. In fact, we consume about a credit card worth of plastic every single year from the food we're eating, because our food is eating our plastic waste. So, it's a big, gigantic ecosystem that sometimes, to your point, I think people often forget.